Coming off the review of the Intel i3-12400F, which is a $130, actually very impressive CPU, we're now looking at the i5-12400 or 12400F. They're about the same, other than the presence of the IGP. The price class is around $180 to $200 retail. We bought ours for $200, the non-F version. And we're going to be looking at this versus the obvious competition from AMD, so that'd be like the R5-5600X, for example. Looking at some older CPUs as well, like the 2700X, the 3700X, and Intel's alternatives, especially those available right now, to help you decide which one makes the most sense for your type of build. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's X570 Dark motherboard. The EVGA X570 Dark is a high-end motherboard for AM4 CPUs, built around extreme overclocking and tested heavily by EVGA's Kingpin. The X570 Dark has a uniquely rotated socket and RAM layout, 90-degree rotated cables for ease of installation and management, and tons of troubleshooting features to make building, testing, and overclocking easier. Check out EVGA's X570 Dark high-end motherboard at the link in the description below. So main things to consider here. First of all, quick correction for the previous one. Intel had originally released a slide deck that stated that H610 was only one memory channel. Intel later released a corrected version of that slide deck. It's two channels for H610, but it is one DPC or one DIMM per channel. So we went off the specs of the slide deck in our previous review, but the slide deck changed at some point after it was published. So anyway, that's what it is. It's H610 is still two channels, but it's one DPC, and then you've still got the other limitations on there, like no memory overclocking, half the DMI, things of that nature. So still not a great platform. We still recommend it for really any kind of performance build, but the memory channel difference is a significant one. We wanted to note that. Okay, specs for the i5-12400. So this thing, it's 6 cores, 12 threads. It has 0 E-cores. We'll show the Intel Arc page for it. Maybe put it up next to the 12100F or something like that. It is a 4.4 gigahertz boost target. It's got 2.5 gigahertz base target and runs 18 megabytes of total cache. This CPU is not as simple as the 12900K is in its power targets. It runs 65 watts or 117 watts, depending on if you're PL1 or PL2. Additionally, there is a 12500. It's very similar. The difference between this and the 12500 is the frequency. 12500 has a maximum boost target of 4.6 gigahertz advertised, whereas this is 200 megahertz lower. So that's your difference between those. It'll amount to something. For the most part, 200 megahertz difference. In a lot of games, you're talking about sort of single-digit low percentage changes. So depending on availability and price, it's not a big change. It's worth a couple bucks maybe, but you could also just not have the extra 2% performance and pay less, which is generally what we would recommend. So as we get into this, things to consider. We're looking at this from a couple different perspectives. One is gaming only. One is gaming plus what we call production tasks. Those would be things like programming, rendering 3D animations, or perhaps Unreal Engine playback, things like that. Rendering videos, working in Photoshop, and then we'll also be looking at just doing those things when we talk the conclusions, whether it's worth getting it for only gaming, for a mix, or for only production. Okay, let's get started with the benchmarks. This one's gonna be really straightforward. We've burned through a lot of these Intel Alder Lake CPUs at this point. If you wanna know more about the architecture, we have separate pieces on that. We have separate pieces on the chipset differences. We've got separate pieces on almost all the CPUs that are sort of relevant to the core audience right now. You can check those all in the links in the description below, but to save time, we're not going to go through all the same information again today, and instead we'll focus on the charts for the 12400/12400F. Let's get started with the gaming section. In Counter-Strike Go, the i5-12400 ran at 266 FPS average, and it had lows paced proportionately behind. So that matches the distribution of the other CPUs we've tested. This lands the 12400 about 6% ahead of the 12100F that we just reviewed, or versus something older, it'd be about 43% ahead of the tried and true R7-2700X. That's a big jump from something that was positioned as a higher end part back in its glory days. As for AMD's modern competition, the R5-5600X places 25% ahead in average FPS, yet the lows aren't much different and the price is much higher, still at about $290 to $300. The 12600K holds only about a 9% lead over the 12400, marking the 12400 as one of Intel's better offerings right now from a value perspective. The 12100F maintains the best overall budget build positioning here, especially for people on a stricter budget with less room to scale, while the 12400 is positioning itself as a value champion with a bit more for thread capability, especially as we move into production tasks. 1440p doesn't change much for the 12400, but that's because the GPU bind doesn't come into play too hard in this game. If you were to run the game with a step-down GPU from the 3080 we're using here, like a 3070, you'd still see good scaling between the CPUs. We'll look at another 1440p result later to represent the lower-end GPU pairing as well. Cyberpunk 2077 gives us a more GPU-constrained test to evaluate. The i5-12400 ran at 170 FPS average here, positioning it right alongside the i5-11600K, and embarrassingly for Intel, the i9-11900K. That wasted space on shelves, better reserved for toilet paper at this point, but then you might confuse the two, so that'd be kind of painful. The 12400 outperforms the new 12100F by 20%, so if you care to do the math this way, that'd be 54% more money for 20% more performance. However, with the 12400F version now in stock at $180, it'd cut closer to 38% more money for the same 20% gain. As for everything else, the R5-5600X and the 12400 were about tied. The 5800X wasn't far ahead, and the 12600K didn't offer any meaningful jump. Compared to some older stuff, the 12400 outdid the 2700X by 43% in average FPS alone, or the 9900K by 10%. In Far Cry 6, the 12400 ran at 133 FPS average with lows proportionally placed. The lows do well here, as opposed to on the 12700K and 12600K, for one simple reason. Although Windows 11 testing is fine for lows on Alder Lake with Far Cry 6 specifically, Windows 10 demonstrates scheduling confusion with E-cores on Intel in this game. The 12400 has no E-cores, similar to the 12100F, and so it has no issues. The 12400 roughly ties the 11900K, and it isn't distant from the 5800X. The R5-5600X allows a few points of a lead to the 12400, while the 12100F is led by 13%. Not enough to really be exciting between the two, but still competitive with more expensive options on the charts. In Total War 3 Kingdoms, the 12400 ended up at about the top of the chart. We're partly bound here, but we're still seeing scaling versus the 5600X, 9900K, 11400, and the 12100F. The lead over the 12100F is about 12%, and it's about 37% against the older R7-2700X. In Rainbow Six Siege, the 12400 ran at 466 FPS average, about tied with the 11600K previously, and ahead of the 3900X, the 9900K, and the 3700X of higher echelon, but older categories. The 12400 leads the 12100F by about 11% once again, and itself is beaten by the 5600X by 3%. That's not error in our testing, it's outside of error, but it is close enough to hardly be noticeable or anything you need to care about. The 1% lows are about the same, with a little more variance in the 0.1% result. We noticed abnormally low, 0.1% lows, on the 12400. On retests, these were reproducible in our benchmarking. As for the 12600K benefit, that's about the same 3% as the 5600X. The 12400 is a good balance of value here, although the 12100F achieves most of the same performance for a lower price. In 1440p testing, the 12400 ended up about tied with the 12600K, but that's expected because we're now GPU bound. The 12400, the 12600K, the 12900K, and everything else around the 355 FPS average range is bouncing off of the GPU limitations. We can't distinguish a difference here, and that GPU bind also benefits the 0.1% low variance a little bit. Our F1 2021 results are brand new, so we don't have as many CPUs tested here as the other tests. That's because it recently got a game update that changed the results. The 12400 ends up just below the middle, leading the 3900X and the 12100F, both by about 12%. The lead over the R5 3600 is about 24%, and that's noteworthy mostly because the 3600 was available for around the same price originally as the new 12400 is. That's finally some progress. It's certainly better than the GPU industry's $1 more for 1% more stagnation that we've had over the past few years now. Time to move on to production benchmarks. We'd expect to see some additional value in the 12400 when compared to the 12100F specifically when we look at this set of tests. Blender cycles rendering is up first. The 12400 required 22 minutes to complete this render, which is about the same time as the i5-11600K and the AMD R5-5600X. It's also not meaningfully behind the 2700X or the 9900K. That's a pretty good position for a $180 to $200 CPU, and unlike in most gaming benchmarks, it does offer a meaningful uplift over the 12100F at 27% reduced time to render. The benefit is almost entirely from the additional 4 threads here, since each one will spawn one tile for the render. In Chromium Code Compile, as a broad reference point for programming workloads, the 12400 required 97 minutes to compile the code base. That's the same as the 9900K, a bit slower than the 3700X, and better than the 5600X, the 2700X, and of course the 12100F. The improvement over the 12100F is about 30% time reduced. For perspective, that'd be about 40 minutes saved off this one task. If doing any kind of regular production workload, this starts to become noticeable. The R7 5800X remains competitive in performance, only at 18% reduced time, but unfortunately, it's around 80% more expensive than the 12400 non-F, or exactly 2 times the price of the 12400F. Adobe Premiere scoring is done in aggregate points combining filters, effects, live playback and scrubbing, and rendering. The 12400 scores 689 points, outperforming the 3600 slightly, and falling behind the 2700X and the 11600K slightly. The 12400 leads the 12100F by 17% here, and the 5600X leads the 12400 by 6%. The next step up Alder Lake CPU, the 12600K, at least that we've benchmarked, offers 30% more performance at about $100 more. Adobe Photoshop is scored the same way as Premiere. The 12400 scored 1072 points, putting it about equal with the R5 5600X and ahead of the i9 10900K and R9 3900X, both of which run more cores and threads, although both architectures are completely different from Alder Lake. The 12600K would offer 5% more performance for $100 more, while the 12400 offers 11% more performance than the 12100F. Here's where it gets pretty interesting. In 7-zip compression, the 12400 did significantly better than the 12100F, a 42% improvement, and it roughly tied the 2700X. The 5600X, however, still leads by 14%. And the 3700X helps demonstrate AMD's natural architectural advantage in compression and decompression tasks. But the 12400 is at least viable. We'd favor AMD if you're doing a lot of this type of task, however the 12400 is acceptable if this is a less frequent workload. Then the interesting bit, in decompression, the 12400 falls down the chart. It maintains a lead over the 12100F, obviously, but the AMD parts pull disproportionately ahead. This is where AMD is comparatively the strongest right now. Power testing is up last. Related to the production test we just did, the i5-12400 pulled about 74 watts at the EPS 12-volt cables in Blender all-core rendering. That has it more power hungry than the 12100, unsurprisingly, and then the 5600X, but it's still okay. It's far more efficient, for example, than the previous Intel architectures like the 7700K and the 9900K especially. In single-core loading, the 12400 pulled about 24 watts, making it similar to the 5600X single-core workload. This is about what we'd expect given the 22-watt pull of the 12100F. So that's it then. Our opinion is this. The 12100F is still easily the budget king right now. The fact that a $130 CPU is actually playing games well is great news. It's good for the budget market, which has needed a revival. Hopefully GPUs sort of follow suit at some point. That combined with maybe a 3050 or a 6500 XT, if they can be gotten around MSRP, which some people will definitely get them there, then that might be a pretty good build or a good combo for a lower entry point in terms of price to actually a very capable gaming PC. Spending the extra $50 or so to go up to the i5 will very heavily benefit you in something like 7-zip or Blender. That's where we saw the biggest improvements. In gaming, there's not as big of a swing. There's potentially an argument to some extent for what people like to call future-proofing. Future-proofing is kind of a thing. It can also be a fool's errand, though. It depends on how the future works out, and we don't know. So in the past, for example, the 4790K versus the 4690K is a fantastic example of a scenario where the 4790K aged a lot better. But it really wasn't until the later years and age of these CPUs that the thread count difference between the two, being double the threads on the i7, really started to show up in gaming benchmarks where some of the more modern games that had finally shifted fully over to at least loading 8 threads were benefited in frame time consistency, whereas early on, sometimes that was visible. For the most part, no. And for the first several years, no, it wasn't a big difference. So this is one of those scenarios where the 12100F, we're fully confident and comfortable with recommending right now today. We think it'll be fine for the vast majority of games for the next couple of years at least, if not a few more than that. But you're going to start feeling the effects of age on that CPU perhaps a little sooner than you would on a 12400, where you get the extra couple of threads to deal with whatever games do in the future. But future-proofing, as we stated, is sort of a random number generator at times. Sometimes it works out the way we think, and sometimes you have Bulldozer. Or Intel, where it thought it was going to have 10 gigahertz single core CPUs at some point. So it doesn't always work out the way people plan. Our recommendation then is pretty simple. Instead of stressing about the future, the question is really, what's in your budget? If you are already sort of stretching to do an i3 at $130, you shouldn't stress yourself out further over putting yourself in the whole 50, maybe 70 bucks, 80 bucks to go up to an i5. It's just, if it's a stretch already, it's not worth feeling financially uncomfortable to upgrade to the i5 for gaming tasks. If you're making money with the CPU and you can't stretch beyond the i5-12400, it makes a lot more sense than the 12100F, where making money here would mean doing something like a Blender, video editing, Photoshop, things like that. The i5 starts to be a lot more appealing. AMD's CPUs are also appealing here though, but the i5 is still cheaper than the direct competition from AMD. So if the i3 is all you can afford, it's a very good option for gaming. It can do these production tasks, as in it is literally capable of them. It's just not very good at them. So if it's not something you're doing every single day, that's fine. If you're doing video editing, coding every day, we would recommend the i5 if you can stretch to it. But it's really that simple. It's just sort of, is it in the budget or not? Do you feel comfortable with the extra 50 bucks? If you do, it's really only hugely worth it. You'll only mainly notice it in your daily life if you're doing those tasks we had in the second half of the benchmarks. So it's a good value CPU, and that's how we would rank these. We'd put the i3 CPU as fairly easy to recommend, confidently recommend in budget class. We would put the i5-12400 or 12400F if you don't need the IGP, which is probable for most of you. We would put that in the value class, meaning it is not as good sort of hard value as an i3 if you're doing some metric like whatever, FPS per dollar, minutes per dollar spent, something like that. The i3 is going to be better technical overall absolute value. The i5 maintains a very strong value while increasing the performance just a little bit more to get you into more mid-range territory rather than closer to bordering low-end territory. Once you go beyond that, value is sort of out the window and you're just in spending money because you can afford it and you're maybe doing some type of work on the machine. You are a frame rate snob, not in a bad way, something like that. So that's how we'd line it up. Intel's in a very strong position right now. It's up to AMD to respond with something in this price class. AMD's CPUs are still good. They desperately need a cheaper CPU in the market to compete with Intel at some point. But AMD stuff is still good. Just sort of look at what you're doing. Doing a lot of compression, decompression. AMD is very strong there right now. That seems to be its primary stronghold at this point versus Intel's newer architecture. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. If you'd like to support us and our ability to buy these types of CPUs and produce the multi-day long review process that we go through, you can go to store.gamersaccess.net and grab one of our limited Disappointment PC Build 2021 t-shirts, where we have the list of the most disappointing things on the back of them. We're in round 3. We are almost out of all the shirts we're going to make for this. Rounds 1 and 2 are already done and sold through. So this will be the last chance. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.